Um, why are we as Electronics Watch running a webinar on bananas? Well, this is the first of a series of webinars and workshops that we will be running as part of our innovation program. For those unfamiliar with us, we're an organization whose mission is to use public procurement leverage to promote and respect the rights of workers in global supply chains. We work with public buyers and labor rights organizations around the world to address exploitation and to engage with industry to address labor rights violations and facilitate access to remedy. If we can move on to the slide, please, Andila, on innovation. Our innovation pilot will take our work beyond the ICT and low-emission vehicle sectors to help public buyers increase their knowledge and their leverage over their suppliers across everything that they buy, from food to textiles, from logistics to construction. We'll also be launching a new program to tackle labor rights violations in the medtech industry next year. At the end of this webinar, we'll tell you how to get in touch with us to learn more about this program. Now it is my privilege to hand over to Banana Link. Over to you, Alistair and Holly.
Great. Thank you, Cindy. And thanks to Electronics Watch, Cindy's efforts, but Electronics Watch collectively as well, for taking the plunge and daring to mix sort of mushy fruit with electronic hardware and software. Let's see how it goes. My background is I founded this organization in 1996. For most of that time, I've lived in the south of France, where I still live, and the rest you can find out from somewhere else. Great to be here anyway. Thanks.
And I'm Holly Woodward-Davey. I'm a project coordinator with Banana Link. It's great to be here and welcome everybody. So my role is working with kind of trade union and small farmer partners in Latin America and the Caribbean on projects that aim to drive forward a more sustainable and fair global banana industry. And I'm going to start sharing the slides now. Hang on, is that? Here we go. Yeah, can everyone see that okay?
Yes, Holly.
Yeah. So, we're talking about banana workers at risk and addressing human rights risks to banana workers from a public procurement perspective today. And just a quick look at the agenda. We'll talk about who Banana Link is, some of the key critical labour risks in the global banana trade, a look at the legislation framework in which the industry sits, how the global banana trade works and the certification schemes, the key certification schemes that apply, how the supply and value chains work, and what we think that buyers can do to improve the situation for workers. And finally, we'll look at some success stories, and we'll have a guest speaker, Emil Burke from the city of Copenhagen. Okay, I'll hand over to you now, Alistair.
Okay, so yeah, as I just mentioned, Banana Link emerged from another organisation. In 1996, there was an NGO in the East Anglia, which is the east of England, working in the farming community, called Farmers Link, working on international issues and what did it have to do with the way food was produced in the fields that surrounded us in Norfolk and Suffolk. It's a small cooperative company limited by guarantee, which is a kind of slightly strange English phenomenon as far as legal structures go, but basically means we're a small team that manages our work in a collegiate cooperative fashion. Although we're not a cooperative trading company as such, but we are a cooperative not-for-profit. And we've never been more than 3 or 4 full-time equivalents, so 7, 8 people at the very most. We're currently 5, 6, yeah. And none of us work full-time, and because we all do other things in our life, either bringing up children or playing music or clowning or whatever, all sorts of things we do. And I guess we are an international NGO, although we're quite small, but we are dispersed today between Mexico, Ecuador, France, and the UK, and Berlin. So we're a bit like Electronics Watch on a slightly smaller scale, i.e. transnationalized in the best sense of the word. Can we have the next one? And yeah, we've done things like you'd see in the bottom right there of, yeah, obviously dressing up as bananas is one of the classic things that people do when they're obsessed by bananas, or they think bananas is a good vehicle for understanding other things, which is essentially why we're working on bananas, is not particularly because we're obsessed by bananas, but because it is the biggest single food product in global retail in most countries of the north, and quite a lot in the south. It's in value and volume, it is the biggest. Our objectives around, I'm not going to go into these very much, but fair and ethical trade practices, what we want to promote. And as you see, we've had nearly 30 years of trying to do it. So we'd like to think that there's been some serious evolution in the right direction. There are still plenty of obstacles, plenty of bad practices, plenty of structural issues that are not resolved, but there's quite a lot of progress as well. Dignity at work is what a lot of people know us for around workers' rights issues, but we also work on sustainable production systems, including notably from a small farmer perspective, because small farmers with 1 or 2 or 5 hectares can find it much easier to develop non-monoculture systems. In short, it's a real challenge to imagine what a non-monoculture banana plantation of 250 or 1,000 hectares would look like. We're working on that as well. But it's, as you can imagine, the big traders and producers of bananas of the world are not about to, in 1 or 2 years, change their production systems to do what some of the small farmers that we work with do and produce diverse crops, intercrop, etc., etc. So what can small farmers teach us about sustainable production systems is our particular focus on that. And is it possible to design agroecological diversified systems for commercial bananas? We don't have the answer to that question. I don't think anybody does, but there are a number of players committed to it, but not enough, not at this stage. But it's very much part of our agenda as well. Constructive dialogue is our modus operandi after 10 years of pretty full-on campaign mode. Information gathering about the supply chain so that we know as much or more than the people where we'd like to be talking to. But campaigns in order to do what? Campaigns in order to bring people to the table. So the last 15 years, we're, I think, pretty wholeheartedly focused on constructive dialogue, but retain the right to campaign when dialogue proves impossible. As a last resort, we are prepared to denounce. I don't know if that's enough, but we'll have a space for questions in a little while, so please feel free. This beautifully designed set of interlocking circles, thanks, Holly, expresses our strategic work areas for the current 5 years, and not going to change much probably for the next 5 years, I imagine. Slightly tweaked, but these all intersect as well. And starting from the top for None of them are a priority over the other. They're all interrelated and equal strategic priorities. So the redistribution of value, which a lot of multi-stakeholder initiatives don't deal with, or only deal with in a what I would regard a quite cosmetic way, i.e. the economics of the distribution of value along the chain, and what kind of mechanisms can you deploy for the social and economic, social and environmental costs that are not paid in any value chain in the modern world. How can you start to bring those in? That's a long-term strategic objective, if you like. Change the way the economy works by counting the social and the environmental costs that are not counted in current pricing, be it for a smartphone or a banana. Then going round anti-clockwise, gender equity and women's empowerment is transversal to everything we've done and will continue to do. Women's leadership, anti-discrimination, obviously, but women's leadership at all levels of trade unions, banana companies, and any other players that are involved in the work we're doing. So without going into detail, that's transversal and will remain so. I'll miss out human rights and environmental binding regulation. I'll come back to that at the end. Occupational health and safety is obvious. Lots of issues in bananas because it's one of the highest agrochemical consuming industries in the world, along with cotton. And not just chemical risks, although those are very, very serious in a lot of countries, but also repetitive strain risks of 12, 14 hours working in a banana pack house, and some of the field jobs as well. So there's musculoskeletal disorders are pretty common both in pack house and field at plantation level. And I guess the most fundamental, the gate to everything else that we do in relation to workers' rights, is the right to exercise the freedom to unionize, the freedom to organize. Yeah. I stress the right to exercise it because lots of companies will say, and lots of companies do say on paper that they respect freedom of association, right of trade unions to organise, but in practice it doesn't happen in quite a lot of spaces. So the point is, can workers exercise that freedom or not? That's the bottom line, and it's the gateway to pretty well all the other rights. Small farmers leading agroecological transitions, I think I've already explained. You can do it at 1 or 2 hectares and it looks amazing, but how do you scale that up? Can it be scaled up? And I said I'd come back to human rights and environmental binding regulation. Well, 25 years ago, we were some of the few people in the dark days of the late 90s talking about the need for regulation when it wasn't fashionable at all. And 20 odd years later, we finally have a somewhat imperfect, but we have a human rights and environmental due diligence legislation at EU 27 level. Real potential in the UK in the next couple of years. South Korea doing work, etc., etc. Australia, even the US, looking at binding regulation about corporate behaviour as far as social and environmental impacts are concerned. I won't talk about risks here, but actual impacts is what matters on the ground to people and to the natural resources that we collectively call the environment. So that set of interlocking issues is what we work on. How do we do it? Advocacy for change. I explained that for the first 10 years we did a lot of campaigning quite directly against the practices of multinationals, and then increasingly against the irresponsibility of retailers in their supply chains. That led to the creation, amongst other things, of the Ethical Trade Initiative back in 1998 in the UK. campaign that we did with a British NGO called Christian Aid. We provided the banana input on that, and that basically said to retailers, look, you may think that it's not your responsibility, but if you're buying from bananas or whatever, grapes, it was quite focused on agriculture, but whatever you're buying, you have some responsibility because you're selling it, and consumers actually care. That was the origin of a lot of other initiatives that are now quite common. So campaigns shifting mode into seeking wherever possible dialogue, bilateral dialogue, trilateral dialogue, multilateral dialogue, multi-stakeholder dialogue, as it's called, but all with a view to worker empowerment, small farmer empowerment. We're talking here today about worker empowerment. Obviously, gathering and sharing information is critical. We need to know as much as anybody else that we're trying to have a dialogue with, because if we don't, then change doesn't happen. It's a slightly schematic way of putting it, but that's our experience. And particularly with a lot of efforts, and I won't go into them, over 25 odd years, to link workers in the south and the north, to link workers and farmers in the south. Between small farmers and workers, often struggles are very similar and overlapping in the same geography or not. But also linking workers directly to retailers. Most retailers haven't got a clue who their workers are at the beginning of supply chains. But Electronics Watch probably knows that better than we do. And it's more true of electronics than it is of bananas. And of course, consumers in the global north, which is where we started in the education and campaigning phase in the first 10, 15 years of existence, that brought fair trade bananas into existence, that brought all the certifications for good or bad into existence, because that was certification. Private certification was the response of the companies to a lot of our campaigns to try and protect themselves and show that they were doing things. So our partners are radically diverse, which is part of our financial strategy. So most of these partners have at some point in the last 3 or 4 years, or currently do, give us bits of money. None of them are major, no one dominant source. But you can see the logos, or maybe you can't because some of them are quite small, but everything from NGOs and civil society alliances to retailer-owned importers in the top right from Norway that some of you recognise, the two Aldis that you definitely recognise, Tesco you probably flashed on. In Latin America, our trade union partners called CEBA, which is a Latin American coordinating body of all the unions across 10 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And a range of other players, such as currently GIZ, the German cooperation agency that most of you know, and British trade unions like Unison. Holly, I think that's pretty well what I wanted to say. Did you please pick up and miss things that I've missed out that were really important to help people understand how we work?
I think you've done a pretty good job, Alistair, and in the interests of time, I think we should probably move on to the poll. Thank you.
So, Electronics Watch colleagues, you had this idea that not to ensure that you're all still concentrating, but to ask some basic questions along the way. We've got 3 or 4 as we go through the session. Shall we wait for people to respond? Who from the Electronics Watch's side is going to report on the results?
We'll give the poll, I think, another few seconds, and then, yeah, we can. Do you want to talk about that, Alistair and Holly? You can see the results. Yeah.
I can see the results. Can you see the results, Alistair?
Yeah. Ecuador comes in at just over half people. Our friends in Côte d'Ivoire would be really impressed by the person who voted for Côte d'Ivoire. I've just spent 10 days there. So.
Okay, I think
Thank
everybody
you,
who's
everybody.
gonna, yeah, thanks.
Thanks, everybody. I think we're going to move straight on to not the answers, but can we have the next slide?
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I think maybe you can just see. So most people voted for Ecuador, and Costa Rica was the second most popular. So we'll disclose the results, the facts about this a bit later on. Anyway, the next slide. Here we are, critical labour risks.
But the majority were right. That's the headline.
Yeah. Alistair, I think you were going to talk about the critical labour risks, or?
Okay. This is not exclusive, because if we get into the detail of it, then we'd be here till the end of the webinar and possibly the rest of the day. But the key workers' right risks, or I prefer to say real issues on the ground, risks from a buyer's point of view, obviously, are related to, and in no particular order, but starting with trade union, the right to exercise the freedom of association, as it's called in English, trade union freedom, as it's called in French and Spanish in ILO texts. So the right to exercise that freedom, and in some countries where there is systematic persecution, like Costa Rica, or de facto persecution in most places like Ecuador, which is the biggest exporter, a third of world trade. So Costa Rica being a big exporter and Ecuador being far and away the biggest means that because there are regular cases, and in the case of Costa Rica, systematic cases of persecution of independent trade unions, then we have a major problem. And the biggest supply to the US market is the Guatemalan Pacific coast. Most of Guatemala is not unionized. The north coast is, the south coast isn't. And that's 4 bananas in 10 in North America. I know most of you aren't from North America, but it's a real issue. And we just have, as of a month ago, the very first union that we hope will survive assassination attempts in the past, that will be able to survive and grow in the Guatemalan Pacific South. So these are real bottom line serious issues. And as recently as last year, women trade union leaders get killed in a place like Guatemala, banana workers leaders. Health and safety, huge chemical exposure from everything from insecticides, herbicides, fungicides being aerially sprayed in most cases, but also more toxic things called nematicides, which are there to kill little wormy things that live in the roots of bananas. Yeah. But the chemicals involved, the worst of the insecticides and the nematicides, and the systematic exposure to them for people working in plantations, even when the companies respect the rules and 24-hour exclusion and all that, there's still the surrounding communities and workers themselves are living and working with huge residue levels. Only a tiny bit of those residues appear in bananas once they're exported, but in situ in plantations and pack houses, they're an everyday reality for the 88% of the industry, which is not organic. Poor wages and insecure work. The wage gaps vary from about half of what we might call a living wage level, a minimum living wage level, in the worst cases, through to a place like Colombia, where virtually all workers are earning what people have calculated to be a living wage. Most banana workers earning at least double the minimum wage, and all but a small percentage earning above even a living wage level. Why? Because they've bargained over 30 years with their employers to raise those wages and improve their conditions. And in the case of Colombia, as we'll see, do other things as well. Lack of gender equity, it's probably 12% of people working in the banana industry are women. That varies from 6% to 35%, depending on the country, for all sorts of complex historical reasons. But they are the minority. In Latin America, almost no women work in the field, whereas in Africa, it's relatively common, not in all jobs in the field, and not in chemical application on the whole. But the lack of gender equity is not just about workers. It's also in the management of companies, which are often very male and therefore very male focused and very blind to women workers and their issues. Never mind, being fired for pregnancy in Ecuador, which is unfortunately still a reality in 2024. And exploitation of migrant labour, the banana industry from the 19th century onwards, when it first came into existence with the famous United Fruit Company. The companies have always found it beneficial, financially beneficial, to import labour across borders, be it for Costa Rican labour going to work in Panama plantations across the border, or Panamanian workers crossing the other way on the same train line to go and work in Costa Rica. So that's the end of the 19th century. Well, bring it up today, you've got 80% of Dominican Republic's workers are Haitian from the other third of the island, Hispaniola, that they share. And many of those do not even today have access to basic healthcare, social security, and a whole range of other rights that their Dominican counterparts do. Nicaraguan migration in Costa Rica, Nigerian migration into Cameroon, etc., etc. In some cases, in Africa, I think either because it's happened over 2 or 3 generations, or because there are big cultural and economic similarities that make it less problematic. But in the Americas, migrant labour is still very common and very problematic. And probably the worst single case is Belize, where we're not even allowed to go. There we go. I'm not going to talk about the bottom part of this because you all know that stuff. It's relevant in international agreements, ILO conventions, UN SDGs, the EU, CSDDD, all that stuff, so I'm not going to go through it. And you'll have these slides, so if you want to study it in detail, please do. But the top 3 labour legislation facts concerning the banana industry are that the Ecuador, the Philippines and Guatemala, 3 of the 5 biggest exporters, are all in the latest ITUC global survey of the top 10 worst countries for workers. From slightly different perspectives, but in all cases to do with violence, in some cases to do with particular violence against trade unionists who seek to organise. But all 3 are in the top 10. You can read for yourself in the ITUC Global Survey 2024. Numerous complaints in all banana countries, with very few exceptions, to the International Labour Organization's Committee on Freedom of Association. Over the years, sometimes they get resolved, but often they don't. Costa Rica, it's 40 years since the industry, with its allies, put lots of money into destroying an independent trade union movement that organised pretty well 100% of the industry and had very good collective bargaining agreements and double minimum wages. 40 years on, there's one collective bargaining agreement amongst 150 plantations. And as we'll hear, a whole range of direct persecution issues in 2024 still. Due to the importance of bananas in global food retail, I said it's the #1 food product that they buy and sell in volume and value. But because of that, it's been a high priority for big supermarket buyers, retail buyers, in even ahead of legislation being approved, working out how compliance with the forthcoming legislation, either at national level in France and Germany or now at EU 27 level, and potentially, as I say, in the UK. It's become a priority, and obviously that's a key bit of leverage that we use with big retail buyers. Holly, I think that's over to you. Oh no, it's over to a video before you.
Thank you. I'll stop sharing now because Ndila, I think, will share this video, which is a worker in Ecuador talking about the issue of the aerial spraying of chemicals that Alistair mentioned.
Nosotros la habíamos que pasar la avioneta, nosotros pegamos la carrera y nos tirábamos a los montes, o si no cortábamos hojas de esto y nos tirábamos encima. Para que no nos caigan. Wow. Pues a mí se me hinchó todo, se me hinchó los lomos, todo se me hinchó. Porque era de funigar y un pana se nos murió trabajando, así mismo que trabajamos en la misma hacienda que trabajamos juntos. Y como es que hagaba un poquito de comida en una hojita de estas, de plátano envuelta, vino el pana se la comió. Y ya había pasado la avioneta. Ya después el hombre, como a los 15 días empezó, el hombre está enfermo. Enfermo. Hasta que murió.
Okay. So I'm just going to talk a little bit now about the global trade. We'll have a few more videos and polls to break it up a bit, but we've heard who Banana Link is. We've heard what the critical labour risks are. So we've also heard a little bit about the industry, but as Alistair said, it's the leading food product in volume and value in many markets. It's the biggest global fruit trade. Around 20 million tons of bananas are exported annually, with the value of the global market being between 9 and 10 billion USD at export and 25 billion at the retail stage. Latin America and Central America together produce over 3/4 of the world's export bananas, and Europe, the EU with UK and Ukraine as well, import almost 1/3 of global bananas from the banana export trade. So it's a key food security crop grown in 150 countries worldwide, but only about 15% of those are actually exported. Unlike any other agricultural or agro-industrial crop, it produces year-round and is harvested year-round. So the life cycle from a new plant to harvest is usually about 9 to 10 months. It's a very labour-intensive crop. It's generally the leading expense in the cost of production. It can be around 45% of the cost of production, which is why labour rights, cost savings are often made in the area of labour. So that's why it becomes such a big issue. So it's also, conventional bananas are also one of the most chemical dependent crops worldwide. And as we saw, pesticides are often applied by small planes, and those bags that they're hauling the bananas in this picture here are also impregnated with pesticides. So that's why it's really not a good idea to eat any food that falls inside of one of those bags. Once the bananas are ready, the bags and the bunches are hauled in by this cable. That's what this guy here is doing. And they're taken to the packing house. So as Alistair said, that packing house is generally where women workers are employed. There's a kind of stereotype that the work in the field is much too heavy for women, and also there's more of a risk of chemical exposure, which is particularly dangerous to women because of their reproductive function. Those chemicals are really, really bad for developing embryos. And so women are generally employed in the pack house, and there's much there's fewer roles to be offered in the pack house. So that leads to the dominance of the industry by male workers in the field. Yeah, so in the pack house, they're weighing, grading, stickering the bananas and then boxing them for export. After packing, the bananas are shipped in containers on refrigerated vessels. It can take 10 to 20 days for them to be shipped from Latin America to Europe. And when they arrive in Europe at the port, they have to pass through customs, and then they're taken to ripening warehouses where they're sprayed with ethylene gas to make them ripen. And then they're transported to wholesalers and regional distribution centres and delivered to stores. So, Alistair, did you want to carry on with this part? Or?
No, just very quickly, we don't want to drown people in facts, but the dark blue is exports. So you can see the big five there, the answers to the questions from the poll. Ecuador, pretty close to a third of world trade. Guatemala grown very fast in the last 10, 15 years because of the Pacific South and the close proximity to the US market and some of the most fertile soils in the world. So at 13% of the world market, Philippines 12, going down because of a disease that until today at least the industry hasn't found a solution to, either chemical or biological, a soil-borne disease. Colombia in there, and Costa Rica. Colombia and Costa Rica are roughly the same size these days. So those are the big five exporters. You've got Cote d'Ivoire down there at 2%. Dominican Republic gone down to 1%, was at 3% a few years ago because of a range of issues, particularly climatic deregulation. In the case of the Caribbean, it's pretty serious. Those are the exporters. The importers, obviously, the EU 27 is the biggest. United States, etc., etc. China as well. China is the 5th biggest producer and one of the biggest importers. Okay, so it doesn't produce everything that it now consumes. Global banana trade, there we go. That's just separating them out so you've got it clear who the big exporters are into the EU. This is just into the EU. This is not global market. This is Ecuador has become over the last 2 or 3 years dominant of the big three. Ecuador, followed by Colombia, followed by Costa Rica. Ecuador has lots of other export markets. Colombia is 80% of what's exported comes to the EU. Those 4 brands used to have 85% of the world market when we started working on bananas in the 90s. They now have less than 50%. You might well ask why. Largely because of a reform to EU import policy in 2006 after the longest dispute in the history of the World Trade Organization over that import policy. The liberalization that took place in 2006 opened the EU market in the way that the North American market has never been opened and is up till today completely controlled 90+% by the 3 on the right, Chiquita, Dole and Del Monte. In monocrop production systems, mainly conventional, as we've already said. Holly, this one's you.
Yeah, there's a lot of information here. I'll try and go through it fairly quickly. But so just to look at some of the key certification schemes that apply in the banana industry, obviously fair trade, private certification scheme, the smallholder organizations or plantations that hire workers, has social and environmental standards, but distinguishes itself in particular by having its minimum farm gate and export prices per country per banana box, and higher if they're organic. In the UK and the EU, it has around 10% of the market share. Organic private certification recognised by many governments, obviously based on a production system that uses very much lower levels of synthetic pesticides, if at all, and employing other ecological practices in place of chemicals. has about 12% share of both the EU 27 and US markets, and more than 80% of fair trade certified bananas are also organic certified. We've got Rainforest Alliance, another private environmental certification born out of a campaign against banana plantation expansion in the primary forests of Costa Rica in the 2000s. Social requirements were added, but there's no minimum price mechanism as there is with fair trade, and there's also a pretty poor record on labour rights. And then Global Gap, which is a private certification originally focused on food safety and production practices for big retailers. Some social standards were added in around 2010 as the add-on GRASP. It's a de facto requirement of all retailers and business to business instead of consumer facing. So from our view, here's just some key issues with the certification schemes. There's a cost element. So big buyers are putting the cost of these certifications onto their suppliers, but there's often a lot of different certification schemes they're having to meet the standards for. Retailers often also have their own in-house standards. And, you know, if you look at a producing farm that's supplying also to not just one buyer, they may have, you know, dozens of different standards that they have to satisfy, which is even more challenging for smaller producers who don't necessarily have, you know, a dedicated person to ensure compliance. Also, decertification is not generally in the interest of certifiers, although you know, Fair Trade and Rainforest Alliance are non-profit. They do get money from things like license fees, and yeah, so decertification is not in their interests. So, and yeah, as I said, Rainforest Alliance has pretty poor record on labour rights risks, especially freedom of association. And Global Gap only covers labour rights in its GRASP standard. We often hear about auditors being pretty weak on identifying core violations to things like freedom of association. They may lack relevant experience or training, and often we're told, you know, workers are advised, that farmers are advised before the auditor comes, and then the workers are told how to respond. They're given the right equipment and clothing, how to respond to questions. Any migrant workers that shouldn't be there are maybe taken somewhere else for the day, and then once the audit's been done, they're giving back the clothes that they were given for the audit and the equipment, etc. And, you know, so yeah, it's not necessarily very strong on identifying occupational health and safety and labour violations. And from our perspective, in particular with fair trade, which we generally really support because of its minimum price and the premium, but there is a kind of conflict between the workers' committees, which is a prerequisite of certification, and they decide how the premium is spent, but they can kind of inhibit the activity of independent unions, and there isn't really a kind of a road map for those workers' committees to become independent workers' unions that can do things like negotiate for wages. And also in the banana industry, there's been a move towards certifying more and more large plantations to the point where the market's become saturated. And earlier this year, they said that they're not going to certify any new producers for another couple of years, which is particularly difficult for small producers who tend to really rely on fair trade certification in order to survive. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide now, so that, oh yeah, we now have another video, so I'll hand over to Andila.
Thanks, Holly. Yes, I'll share it right now. There we go.
Por supuesto que los dirigentes sindicales les pusimos a ellos la situación que se vive en Costa Rica, la falta de libertad sindical, la discriminación, la persecución sindical, la no existencia de convenciones colectivas precisamente por estas políticas de las compañías de impulsar otros mecanismos de representación laboral que no son sindicatos. También el tema de la jornada de trabajo, los salarios de hambre que se pagan en algunas plantaciones, el tema de la salud ocupacional, en fin, toda la violación que se da en los temas laborales, que ellos pues están interesados en escuchar, como decíamos, para mejorar sus políticas de compra. Obviamente, le hicimos la propuesta de que ellos deben de exigir a las empresas que producen bananos y piñas que van a Europa y Estados Unidos que se respeten los derechos de los y las trabajadoras, crear mecanismos conjuntos de seguimiento. Les explicamos a ellos que las únicas organizaciones que podemos dar fe si se cumple o no los derechos laborales somos los sindicatos independientes, no otras formas de representación, no las certificadoras como Rainforest Alliance, por ejemplo, que es una cómplice y le dejamos claro que esta certificadora lo que han hecho es engañar a los consumidores y a los supermercados, porque en las fincas que están certificadas con estas certificadoras, pues sencillamente se violentan.
So that we should mention is Didier Layton from the Costa Rican Workers Union, CITRAP. And so next, I think I'm going to hand back to you, Alistair, for an overview of the banana supply chains.
Thanks, Holly. Yeah, just to say that Didier worked 19 years in a Del Monte plantation before he took on the general secretaryship of the trade union that's for the last 10 years. And is one of those people who's been made sterile by the chemicals he applied in the 80s and 90s in those plantations. Banana supply chains. I think you're beginning to get the picture, but just to put it graphically. So production and packing, small, medium, large scale being, as I say, can be thousands of hectares but pack houses tends to be a pack house every 200 or 250 hectares. Production and packing through to export, through to import. Often they're the same company. Yeah. There's a shipper that's contracted, but the importers and the exporters are often the same company, in the case of the multinationals, obviously, but also even in the case of national traders. And then when they arrive, picked up from the docks, go imported, and the importer and Righton is often the same company as well in most of Europe now. So there become less and less players in the banana. The banana chain has become shorter and shorter, unlike textile or clothing or electronics chains. So from the little we know, and this is our confession and why we welcome working with Electronics Watch and all of you are on this call, and hope that this will be the beginning, not a one-off. The little we know about public procurement, because it's not been a focus. Very, very frankly, we haven't had that focus, but we're discovering there are actually quite significant volumes being bought by, anything from cities to regions to countries, or the universities of a country or whatever. So significant volumes for all sorts of reasons from what we're observing, and please tell us if we're wrong, but we think that most of where you are buying bananas, for those who are, the relationships are indirect with the supplier farms. There may be 2 or 3 intermediaries at least. Well, 2 or 3. Pretty well all, if it's fresh bananas, will have minimum 2 certification requirements and up to 4, 5 or 6, with lots of duplication, obviously, but that's the world we're in. Obviously, we understand that public procurement has a lot to do with the authorities that you're working for own your own corporate social responsibility policies. And we understand that the final consumers, let's say, are in schools, hospitals, care homes, offices of the public authority, etc. So that's the little we've gathered. Here we got a question for you, because we've given you a lot of stuff and made a lot of input. So question 2. And when you can we just clear the screen so I can read the text of the question? Because consider the cost. It's the consumer price, the proportion of the price to the consumer. That's the question. Is it 1, 10, 15 or 25?
So I think about half of people have responded now, so we'll just give it another few seconds.
Yeah.
There's also a second question, so what percentage of the cost of a typical banana would the retailer get is the second question, and the first is what cost of a typical banana.
You're all extremely pessimistic. So we've got good news for you. Hey, in inverted commas. Do you want to go on to question 2 before we comment on either?
Well, I think everybody's answered question 1, and everybody agrees they think the worker gets 1% of the value of a typical banana.
Yeah, go on question 2. Have we put that up?
Question 2, they've also answered, and it's 5 people think that the retailers get 20 to 30%, 6 people think 40 to 50%, 4 people think over 50%, 1 person thinks 10%, and nobody thinks that the retailers would get 0 or less % of the value of a typical banana. So I will move on.
Okay, thanks everybody. Can we stop sharing that? Okay, so I'm going to show you 3 banana splits. This one we haven't actually split it up with some lines, but you can get the figures are pretty clear. Can we just get rid of the thing? Oh, it's maybe on my screen. There we go. Yeah. But so these are the figures calculated pretty exactly from years of research on actual prices. Some of these prices are very difficult to get, but this is on conventional African bananas coming into a big French retailer recently. These figures were derived 4 years ago and haven't changed significantly in that time. So the workers get 4%, the retailers 49%, and in the middle you can see. So 17% stays in the producing country. This obviously varies depending on specific supply chains, but this is a generic, conventional African banana going into French retail, where the prices are pretty well, for most of the last 10 years, have been pretty well double for the same banana sold in the UK. These figures are from the UK. Reality is more complex, maybe, than it's perceived to be. Let's start at the bottom right. Retailer minus 2%. What does that mean? Well, it means that the retailer's actually selling at a loss, which is illegal in most European continental geographies, but it's not illegal in the UK. Okay, so you sell at a loss because you think that cheap bananas brings people into your shop rather than somebody else's. So for that first 7 years, that's what many UK retailers selling fair trade. Three UK retailers sell only fair trade. And a lot of them, they all buy from some quantity from Colombia. So they were selling at a loss for 7 years. One retailer, we estimate, lost in pure financial value, £30 million, so 35, 40 million euros, because just to sell fair trade bananas as cheap as everybody else was selling pretty well everybody else was selling. Sorry, can we just go back?
Yep, sorry, Alistair. I think we are a bit worried about time, so
Yeah.
I'm going to move through a little bit quickly.
Okay. Keep going then.
Okay.
Power and leverage. Well, there's power and leverage along the chain. And whether they be the multinational brands, the four I showed you, national growers that aren't part of a multinational company. There's some very big national growers in Latin America. The certifiers we've talked about enough. They have a lot of power, but are they prepared to use it? On the whole, no, is my answer. Shippers, well, we've seen under COVID how shippers have enormous capacity to not be influenced by public opinion. Yeah, and charge pretty well what they like. And that remains the case. And interestingly, the three biggest shipping companies in the world are all European. It's probably the only sector in the world economy where the three biggest multinationals are all European. And the rest, I think, speak for themselves, and we've said enough about. Wholesalers, though, special mention, if you're buying from wholesalers, they have the least leverage of anybody in this list. Consumers we could talk about, that's more complex. Holly, over to you.
Thanks. So we've kind of looked at the industry as a whole. We've seen some of what the key issues were and the videos of workers, representatives, and workers themselves talking about the key issues. So next question is, what can retailers and public buyers do? I'm going to try and get through this a bit quickly because we're slightly running over time, but I think the first thing to say is be informed, and as you see, don't assume that certification schemes alone can guarantee ethical production systems. Ask more questions from your suppliers and engage with organizations who have expert knowledge, because every country and even regions within countries are different and there's different issues. If it's possible, use your purchasing power and buy from origins that do have a strong background on independent workers unions, collective bargaining agreements in place, and things like that. I think responsible purchasing practices is really important. So paying a fair price and having longer term contracts that build confidence with producers, and a price that allows them the ability to invest in workers in the environment as well. So internalizing things that have been treated as externalities for a long time. Also, I think it's important to say, work with suppliers, so avoid zero tolerance policies, because that's just going to lead to covering up issues instead of dealing with them. Something that I think is really important is just to publicly state your position and influence others with your support for things like social dialogue, the important role of independent workers' unions, the need for gender equity and women's empowerment, sustainable production methods and just transitions towards them that doesn't leave anyone behind, and includes workers and small farmers, and paying a fair price and responsible purchasing practices. So yeah, publicly stating your support for those things. I think it's also amazing if you can, as public procurement teams, work together, sharing information, developing good practice, pooling resources, joining multi-stakeholder forum like the World Banana Forum, which I think at the moment has very limited or possibly nobody from public procurement at the table. If possible, directly support workers and small farmers with country-specific programs that support capacity building of unions, occupational health and safety initiatives, and so on. And just bottom line, remember, nothing for the worker without the worker. So any initiatives that you're trying to support, make sure that worker voice is built into them. And so we were going to show another video, but I think we're going to just skip that because we're a bit short of time. So the next part of the presentation is on success stories. And hopefully we can leave on a happy note with some success stories. And I'll pass back to you, Alistair, to talk about retailer shared responsibility, action towards living wages.
Okay, so essentially 15 years or so of pointing the finger at retailers because of what you've just seen in the story of them getting the biggest slice of the total value, and also the biggest share of profits along the chain by a long way. We also flagged up the issue of living wages 20 years ago. And finally, 15 years later, the message starts to get through, and there is now real movement. There's now real movement. So in the framework of the World Banana Forum, we were able to get, after 3 years negotiation, a quite clear statement about the commitment to living wages across the global banana trade from all members of the forum, and to make it clear that the responsibility of the final buyers in making that happen is as important as the direct employers of the workers. So what took longer is to get people to understand that the most sustainable way of negotiating living wages for all in any one geography is collective bargaining, preferably across many workplaces, preferably at a national level. That's only really happened in the last few months, and massively helped by the ILO finally, after 105 years, getting a mandate to work on living wages and laying out in March 2024 what I've just said, which is social dialogue and collective bargaining are the route to negotiating sustainable living wages. In between, before we got to where I've just said, in this year, quite a lot of retailers have committed in Netherlands, Germany, Belgium, and the UK between 20 and 2023 to living wages in all their banana supply chains. They haven't done it for other supply chains yet, but why do they do it in bananas? Well, we've already answered that question near the beginning. It's one of their highest risk and their biggest single value and volume product. So,
Alistair, I'm going to jump in just to say we wanted a little bit of time for Q&A. So I wonder if we could skip quickly through. Thank you.
That's it.
The next, yeah.
You can read that later if you like.
Yeah, everybody will get the slides.
Let's go to Emile, and we can share the Colombia and Côte d'Ivoire success stories. And you're cutting the last question as well? I think the last question might be worth.
Let's go for the quick poll.
Yeah. Okay. So how many retailers in the UK and Europe have made a public commitment to pay banana workers a living wage?
Opinion pretty split. One person got the right answer. 34. Some of them are national versions of the same company, Aldi's and Lidl's, but they are 34 different retail brands in their national geographies. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So I think now
the Nordics are reported to be on the way, and we're working hard on France. Okay. Emile, I think it's over to you.
Let me just stop sharing my screen. Hang on. There we go. Emile, are you ready to talk? Or was I supposed to stop sharing?
I think we've got a slide from Emile on your slide deck, Holly.
Here we go. Yeah. There we go.
So, does it work now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Good. Okay, well, thank you for the time. I have the pleasure of trying to, in a very brief time, try to to explain how a public entity like the city of Copenhagen, how can we actually benefit from all this knowledge that we have heard about for the last hour and 10 minutes. So how do we take all this information and actually put it into practice and our own purchasing practice? I've actually taken one of the bananas with me. I don't know if you can see it. I can't see it myself, but here it is. It's from Ecuador. It is imported to Scandinavia. I also know that it is sold in Sweden in Coop and ICA. So Björn, you're probably also enjoying this banana at some times. I'm not sure. And anyone else from Sweden? No, we should try to get it a bit more concrete on how these global supply chains actually work. But now I'm going to tell a bit about our risk-based approach and our dialogue with our suppliers and our attempt to engage with the local stakeholders as part of our due diligence work. We use a risk-based approach when we do human rights due diligence. We look into our different suppliers and the different categories that we buy. We very much prioritize agricultural products like bananas and a lot of other stuff. Obviously also ICT, workwear, textiles, and then within the city limits, we also look into construction and cleaning and services and logistics, where we actually do follow-ups on our suppliers and their sub-suppliers. We try to have a dialogue with our supplier about their own human rights due diligence processes, and then we usually also try to do some kind of follow-up. We have obviously chosen bananas. I think what has already been mentioned, that it is the most sold fruit in the world. That's also the case for us. I think we buy for around €500,000 or a bit more of bananas every year. That is not a lot compared to many of these supermarkets that that you have mentioned. Yeah, and let's say this particular case, I mean, we've done a lot of follow-up with agriculture over the last couple of years. We have followed up with our supplier and their sub-suppliers in Spain, where we have visited tomato, cucumber, bell peppers, and other produce that is produced there, to follow up what is the situation there. I mean, it's also a high risk. I think we would consider all agricultural products high risk products because you have bad labor practices in Denmark, in Spain, and now we finally found a way to look into our banana plantation, to our bananas, and that was with the help of Banana Link. So what we actually did is we contacted Banana Link, I think more or less a year ago. Yeah, something like in November, I think. So a bit less than a year. And then we actually have a meeting with our supplier one more time. So this time we're going to look into to our banana supply chain. So we actually asked them to inform us where are they produced, what kind of methods do they, what kind of human rights due diligence do they actually have in place to follow up. And I think our experience, or what we our conclusion was that I think they have a very thin or not very ambitious human rights due diligence setup. They rely solely on these global gap grasp certifications or analysis and audits. So we thought it was actually necessary to have someone to look into the actual conditions, working conditions, and other challenges that might be in our supply chain. So we contacted Banana Link, and after we had a meeting with our supplier, they actually provided us both with the grasp reports of these plantations, and based on that, we actually made a selection of 6 plantations that we would like for them to look into, and then together with Banana Link, we developed a questionnaire, and Banana Link already knew and was already working with 2 local consultants, Juan and Jose, who were doing some work for them on the ground in Ecuador. So we sent them out actually to have these interviews at the plantations. That also took some time because we had to send some kind of introduction letter to our supplier, who would then send it to the plantation and through the Dole company, that is also the one that are importing and exporting for us, for our supplier. So that took some time. It also took some time to kind of convince our supplier that it was a good idea. We have a CSR annex to the contract, so they actually obliged to support us and to assist these kind of follow-ups that we do. And then after a couple of months, where these 2 consultants, Juan and Jose, were around at these 6 plantations, they came back with some preliminary findings of the study, and I think they pointed to there were 2 issues that kind of concerned us. One was freedom of association. It seemed like they interviewed 50 people distributed on these 6 plantations, and they came back and said that quite a number of these people expressed some kind of fear about organizing a trade union. They were asked, how do you think your employer will react to you joining a trade union or forming a trade union? And the answer was, they all said,
yeah, I'm so sorry, but we are running out of time. If it's possible just to wrap up in the next minute, that would be great, please. So sorry.
We did the follow-up interviews, and we still don't know the answers yet. But we think there will be some issues regarding gender discrimination in the employment, but also trade union, or what's called the freedom of association in our supply chain. I think we have quite a lot of leverage, even though, our purchase, our spend on bananas is very, very limited compared to any supermarket chain. But then again, I think we have a big leverage on our supplier because it's us, and then it is the central purchasing body in Denmark. I think we combined have around 20% of their annual turnover of our supplier, which actually gives us some kind of leverage. The question is then, how much leverage do they then have on the entire supply chain? So yeah, I think that's it for me.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
So we were just going to wrap up with a few key takeaways. If you retain anything from our presentation, we'd like that to be to ask questions, to get to know your supply chain better, to engage with experts and consult, with workers' unions and NGOs with local knowledge, experts who can advise and guide and support, and to consider whether there is any scope for protecting workers in tendering processes and sourcing requirements. And with that, I will wrap it up, as I know we want to see if anyone's got any questions to ask. There are also some resources that will be circulated, things that have been referenced in today's presentation. And I will stop sharing now and hand the floor over. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Banana Link and to Emil for an excellent presentation. We feel really bad that there was so much material that we have kind of almost run out of time for questions. My colleague, Andila, will just speak now for a few minutes, but if you do have any questions or comments, please post them in the chat. I think that we would be very happy to follow up with you and answer any questions through Banana Link's expertise and Emil. And so I'm just going to hand over to Andila, and in the meantime, just put any comments in the chat and we'll make sure to follow up. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much, Cindy. So maybe shall we just take one question? I can see that we have a question in the chat, and then we can wrap up. And please, for other participants, just like Cindy mentioned, include all your question in the chat, and we will send you the reply. So we have a question for Banana Link. How do you maintain your independence when you get funding also from retailers, such as Tesco, Lidl, so on?
Should I go for it straight away? Yeah, I mean, simply by not accepting very much money and being prepared to be critical even if they don't fund us again, and diversifying as much as possible across different types of funders and not depending on multi-annual projects when it comes to companies. That's the short answer. But yeah, absolutely critically aware.
Thank you, Alistair. And then I think I will start to wrap up because we have a few information to share.
There's a quick question for Emil on the same
Emil's got his
question.
mouth full.
Just a very quick one. Oh, he's eating his banana.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Maybe we'll give you.
I'm fine. Go ahead.
Do you want to quickly respond, or do you want to just write that in the chat so that Andila just carries on and you finish your banana?
Oh, it's fine. No, it's part of a food contract, so they sell us whatever. I mean, bread, rice, potatoes, bananas, canned tuna, sausages. It's the entire. I mean, all kinds of food.
Okay.
Try
Thank
to have
you.
as few suppliers as possible, because there's a lot of transport and extraction and ordering and all this. So to make it easier. But our bananas are organic. I forgot to say that when I watched this video. I thought it was horrible to see how people can die and get infertile from all these with the chemicals that you use. So that's at least one easy thing, I think, is to cut out a lot of these pesticides and fungicides, is to have organic production.
Thank you very much, Emil. So now, just before closing the webinar, I'll just share my screen just to share a couple of information. So first, the first thing, once again, thank you very much to our expert speakers, Holly and Alistair, for your comprehensive presentation. Thank you, Emil, as well, for providing us with your perspective from the public buyer side, what you are doing in your banana supply chain with the support of Banana Link. Thank you also to all the participants who joined us today for the first knowledge building webinar. So we hope that this webinar provided you some food for thoughts for those procuring bananas in what you could do to drive change in the workers' condition in the banana supply chain. And also, please feel free to reach out to Banana Link if you want to follow up on this topic. We also hope that the webinar provided you an idea of what we will be proposing as part of the knowledge building workstream next year, which is part of a bigger project, which is the innovation pilot. So what we are planning for next year is to have 5 sector-specific webinars and 2 other webinars that will be dedicated on providing some support and advice to public buyers on identifying credible and quality evidence. And for your information, we will be sharing briefing notes and the slides that have been presented today. And if you want to join the knowledge building work stream, or you want to learn more about the innovation pilot, please feel free to contact either Cindy or myself. Our emails are in the slide. And one last point, just a save the date. So Electronics Watch is organizing its annual conference, and the theme is public procurement and the evolving due diligence landscape. The conference will be held on the 6th and the 7th of November in Brussels. So for a public session, they will be open on the morning of the 6th of November, and you can register for this session with the link that has been shared by my colleagues in the chat. And if you have any question about the conference, or also the innovation pilot or the knowledge building, please feel free to contact us. So thank you again for joining us. And we will be in touch and we will share the materials with you. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.